There are two things I've always believed in: the satisfying heft of a balanced ledger and the simple peace of a well-maintained suburban lawn. My HOA president, Karen, managed to weaponize one of those against me, so I decided to return the favor with the other. It turns out that the only thing more satisfying than a perfectly reconciled account is a perfectly executed plan that sends a tyrant's meticulously constructed little empire crashing down around her. My name is Mark. I'm 45, an accountant, and I live what most people would call a quiet life. I like things to be in order. I reconcile my bank statements to the penny, my sock drawer is organized by color and function, and I find a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in the precise, parallel lines left by my lawnmower on a Saturday morning. When I bought my house in the preserve at Maple Creek, I read the entire Homeowners Association bylaw binder, all 278 pages of it. I didn't just skim it, I understood it. I saw it as a contract, a mutual agreement to maintain a certain standard, a place for people like me. I could not have been more wrong. The source of my error and the eventual architect of her own spectacular demise was Karen. She was the president of our HOA, a woman in her mid-50s with a helmet of blonde hair that seemed immune to wind, rain, and basic human decency. She patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart, which she'd christened the Compliance Cruiser, with a clipboard and a perpetual sneer. She didn't just enforce the bylaws, she wielded them like a battle axe, finding infractions where none existed and interpreting ambiguities with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Our problems started small. A violation notice for my garden hose being visible from the street for a period exceeding 12 hours. It was 12 hours and 15 minutes, to be exact. I had been called into work for an emergency audit. I paid the $25 fine without protest. Then came the notice about my garbage bins. I had put them out at 5:50 p.m. for the 6:00 a.m. collection. The bylaws clearly stated they were not to be placed curbside prior to 6:00 p.m. on the evening before collection. Another $25. My fault, technically. I adjusted my schedule. The escalation began when she fined me for non-conforming seasonal decorations. I had a simple, tasteful autumn wreath on my door. The problem? It contained a synthetic gourd element. Apparently, all decorative gourds had to be 100% organic. This wasn't in the bylaws. I knew this for a fact. I had the section on decorations practically memorized. Article Roman 9, Section 4b: all exterior decorations must be professionally maintained and shall not detract from the harmonious aesthetic of the community. There was no mention of gourd composition. I requested a formal hearing. I arrived at the community clubhouse, a stuffy, unused room in Karen's oversized house, with my copy of the bylaws, complete with color-coded tabs. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by two other board members who looked about as comfortable as hostages. Her husband, Bob, a smug real estate agent with a predatory smile, lounged in the corner, not on the board but always present, like a vulture circling a kill. "Mark," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension, "we're all very busy people. This is about a plastic pumpkin on your door." "It's a gourd," I corrected her calmly. "And the bylaws do not specify material composition. I have the relevant section right here." I pushed the open binder across the table. She didn't even glance at it. "The board has broad discretionary authority to interpret what constitutes a harmonious aesthetic. And we've interpreted that plastic gourds are not in keeping with the upscale, naturalistic vision of the preserve." The two board members mumbled their agreement. eyes fixed on the table. Bob chuckled from his corner. I was overruled. The fine was upheld, and I was issued a formal warning. It was then I realized the truth that the rules didn't matter. Only Karen's interpretation of them did. The binder wasn't a contract, it was her personal holy text, and she was the only one allowed to preach the sermon. The harassment became relentless. My lawn, my pride and joy, was suddenly a source of constant violations. One week, it was over-manicured, creating a visually jarring contrast with the neighboring lawns. The next, a single dandelion that had the audacity to sprout overnight earned me a $1.50 fine for failure to control noxious weeds. I was cited for my car being parked improperly in my own driveway. One tire was 6 inches closer to the property line than the other. I started to feel like I was living under a microscope, a subject in some bizarre suburban experiment. Sleep became difficult. Every creak of a floorboard sounded like Karen on my porch with her clipboard. The breaking point, however, had nothing to do with me. It was about Mrs. Gable. Eliza Gable lived 2 doors down. She was in her late 70s, a widow who had lived in her house since it was built 30 years ago, long before the HOA even existed. She was sweet, kind, and her garden was a riot of colorful, non-compliant flowers that everyone but Karen adored. This past spring, Mrs. Gable had a rough go. She had a hip replacement, and the recovery was slow and complicated. Her daughter came to stay for a while, but eventually had to return to her own family out of state. That's when Karen saw her opening. It started with a lawn. Mrs. Gable couldn't manage the mowing, and the kid she usually hired had gone off to college. The grass got a little long. The violation notices started piling up on her door. Then it was the newspapers, yellowing on her driveway because it was painful for her to bend over. More notices. Her mailbox paint was slightly chipped. Notice. A small crack in her driveway concrete. Notice. Each one came with a heavier fine, plus late fees, plus administrative fees Karen invented on the spot. I tried to help. I started mowing Mrs. Gable's lawn along with my own. I'd collect her papers and bring them to her door. But I couldn't fix the cracked driveway or repaint the mailbox overnight. And Karen was a shark who'd smelled blood. One afternoon, I saw a foreclosure notice taped to Mrs. Gable's front door. I felt my blood run cold. Foreclosure for a few $100s in HOA fines. I walked over and read the notice. Under a rarely used, deeply buried clause in the Bylaws, Article Roman 15, Section 11C, the HOA could place a lien on a property for unpaid dues and fines. And if the lien remained unsatisfied, they could expedite foreclosure proceedings. I knocked on her door. Mrs. Gable answered, leaning heavily on a walker. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She explained that she'd tried to pay the initial fines, but the late fees and penalties stacked up so fast she couldn't keep up on her fixed income. She'd sent letters to the board explaining her medical situation, but received no response. She was terrified of losing the home she'd shared with her late husband. That evening, I saw Karen and her husband Bob standing on the sidewalk looking at Mrs. Gable's house. Bob had a clipboard of his own. He was pointing at the roof, the windows, gesturing expansively. The smug look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated greed. And then it clicked. It wasn't just about power, it was about profit. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my home office, the 278-page bylaw binder open on my desk. The rage I felt was a cold, clean fire. It burned away the anxiety and the frustration and left behind a single, diamond-hard purpose. Karen had weaponized this binder against me, against Mrs. Gable, against the whole neighborhood. She thought it was her shield and her sword. She was about to find out that a sharp enough accountant can turn any book into a weapon. My quest for justice began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet clicks on my computer keyboard. I was an accountant, and my superpower was the forensic audit. I lived and breathed documentation, followed the money, and understood that every transaction tells a story. Karen and Bob had a story, and I was determined to read it from beginning to end. First, public records. It was astonishingly easy. I started with property records for our county. I searched for all properties sold within the preserve at Maple Creek in the last 5 years. Then I cross-referenced that with foreclosure filings initiated by the HOA. A pattern emerged immediately. In the past 3 years, 4 homes had been foreclosed upon by the HOA for relatively small amounts of unpaid fines and dues. In every single case, the property was purchased at the foreclosure auction for a rock-bottom price by a shell corporation. And within months, each property was back on the market, freshly painted and upgraded, sold for a massive profit. The name of the shell corporation: Creekview Properties, LLC. I did a business entity search on the Secretary of State website. The registered agent and sole officer of Creekview Properties, LLC was one Robert Bob Miller, Karen's husband. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was bigger than petty tyranny. This was a systematic, predatory scheme. Karen would identify a vulnerable homeowner, an elderly person, a family going through a divorce, someone who'd lost a job. She would then bombard them with manufactured, trivial violations, racking up fines faster than they could pay. Once the debt was high enough, she'd slap a lien on the property, foreclose, and her husband would swoop in, grab the house for pennies on the dollar, do some cheap cosmetic work, and flip it. They were using the HOA bylaws as a tool for organized crime. Mrs. Gable wasn't a target of spite, she was a business opportunity. But knowing this wasn't enough. I needed to prove it, and I needed to do it in a way that was airtight, undeniable, and, most importantly, perfectly legal. I needed to use the binder. For the next 2 weeks, I became a man possessed. I spent every spare moment poring over those 278 pages. I cross-referenced them with state and local statutes governing HOAs and real estate transactions. I made spreadsheets. I created flowcharts. My quiet satisfaction in rules and order transformed into a ravenous hunger for loopholes, for contradictions, for any lever I could pull. And I found them. Oh, I found them. My plan had 3 prongs, a trident of bureaucratic vengeance aimed directly at the heart of Karen's little kingdom. Prong 1 of the recall. The bylaws had a provision for removing a board member, including the president. It required a petition signed by 30% of homeowners, followed by a special meeting where a majority vote could force a recall. 30% was a high bar. People were afraid of Karen. They grumbled in private but wouldn't dare challenge her openly. I needed to give them a reason and a spine. Prong 2 the audit. Article Roman 7, Section 2A stated that any homeowner could request a full, independent financial audit of the HOA's books, provided they could demonstrate reasonable cause. The cost of the audit would be borne by the HOA itself. I combed through the pathetic, 1-page budget summaries Karen presented at the annual meetings. The numbers were vague, with huge sums allocated to general maintenance, legal fees, and administrative costs. I suspected this was where she was hiding the costs of her foreclosure mill. A full forensic audit would be a grenade tossed into her doctored books. Prong 3: The counterattack. This was the beautiful part. This was the piece of pure, malicious compliance that I savored the most. I went on a walk, a long, slow walk through the entire neighborhood. But I wasn't admiring the scenery. I was carrying a small, discreet digital camera and a copy of the Bylaws. I photographed every single violation I could find, and I found hundreds. Mr. Henderson's basketball hoop was an unapproved shade of orange. The Johnsons' garden gnome was 2 inches taller than the maximum height allowed for whimsical statuary. The Smiths had the wrong species of pine tree as a front yard accent. And then there was Karen's own house. Oh, Karen's house. Her address numbers were a non-standard brass finish, not the mandated brushed nickel. Her downspouts were vinyl, not the required aluminum. And best of all, the flagpole in her front yard, from which she flew the American flag with sanctimonious pride, was 2 feet taller than the bylaw maximum of 20 feet. It was a treasure trove of hypocrisy. For each violation, I filled out a separate, official HOA violation complaint form, which I had downloaded from the community website. I cited the exact article and section number. I attached a time-stamped, high-resolution photograph. In total, I prepared 172 separate violation notices. It took me 3 full evenings. My printer ran out of ink twice. With my arsenal prepared, I began the ground war. I started with my immediate neighbors, the ones I knew were also fed up. I didn't lead with a grand conspiracy. I started with a shared frustration. I showed them the ridiculous gourd violation. They shared their own stories. Then I gently introduced the idea of the petition. What if, I'd say, we could just vote her out? The bylaws allow it. Once I had a small, trusted group, I revealed the information about Bob's company and the foreclosures. I showed them the public records. Fear turned to outrage. My small group of 4 became a dozen. We divided up the neighborhood map and went door to door, always in pairs, armed with a petition and the evidence. We told them about Mrs. Gable. That was the key. Her story made it real, personal, and evil. By the end of the week, we had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners. The next day, I formally submitted the petition to the HOA secretary, a mousy woman named Brenda who looked like she might faint. I also submitted the formal request for a full financial audit, citing the foreclosure patterns as reasonable cause. And finally, I dropped the stack of 172 violation complaints bound with a rubber band onto her desk. The thud was one of the most satisfying sounds I have ever heard. The special meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The air in the community clubhouse was electric. It was standing room only. Nearly the entire neighborhood was there. They weren't just curious, they were invested. They were the army I had quietly recruited. Karen, Bob, and the 2 rubber stamp board members sat at the head table. Karen looked furious, a cornered animal. She opened the meeting by trying to dismiss the proceedings. "This is an illegal meeting," she snapped, "convened based on a malicious and fraudulent petition." "I believe you'll find it's perfectly legal," I said, standing up from the front row. My voice was steady. According to Article Roman 3, Section 5, a special meeting must be called within 15 days of receiving a valid petition signed by over 30% of the membership. This petition was signed by 62%. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta by a disgruntled homeowner who can't be bothered to follow simple rules. This is about Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice rising slightly. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the front row, her daughter beside her. This is about an elderly woman recovering from major surgery, being harassed and pushed into foreclosure over a few $100s in bogus fines so that your husband could snap up her house for his flipping business. The room erupted. Bob jumped to his feet. That's slander. Creekview Properties is a legitimate business. Is it? I asked, turning on the projector I had set up. The first slide showed the public record of Creekview Properties, LLC, with Bob's name listed as the agent. The next slide showed the 4 HOA foreclosed homes. The next showed the rock-bottom auction price paid by Creekview. The final slide showed the massively inflated price at which Bob had sold them. It seems your business model is preying on your own neighbors, using your wife's position as president to generate your inventory. The anger in the room was palpable. People were shouting. Karen was banging her gavel, but no one was listening. And while we're on the subject of rules, I continued, my voice cutting through the noise, let's talk about enforcement. I gestured to the massive stack of papers in front of me. These are 172 violations, filed according to proper procedure, documented with photographic evidence. Over 80 of them are for properties belonging to current board members and their friends, including 10 separate violations for your own property, Karen. It seems that harmonious aesthetic is quite selective. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I could see the 2 other board members shrinking in their seats. Their alliance with Karen was evaporating before my eyes. Finally, I said, there is the matter of the formal request for a full, independent financial audit of the HOA's books, which has been legally filed and must be acted upon. I wonder what an independent auditor will think of the legal fees associated with these foreclosures, and the administrative costs that seem to balloon whenever a vulnerable resident is targeted. That was the kill shot. The fear in Karen's eyes was no longer about losing her position. It was the cold, hard fear of legal consequences, of discovery, of ruin. The vote was a mere formality. It was nearly unanimous. Karen was recalled as president and removed from the board, effective immediately. The 2 other board members resigned on the spot. An interim board was elected, with me as the treasurer, and our first official act was to unanimously approve the full forensic audit and to dismiss all pending fines and legal actions against Mrs. Gable. The room exploded in applause and cheers. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The audit, when it was completed a month later, was devastating. It uncovered not just the predatory foreclosure scheme, but also evidence of embezzlement. Karen had been using the HOA account as her personal slush fund, paying for landscaping for her own house under common area maintenance and using legal fees to pay for personal consultations. The state attorney general's office got involved, tipped off by an anonymous but very well-documented package I sent them. Karen and Bob were hit with a litany of civil and criminal charges of fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement. Their assets were frozen. They were forced to sell their house, the one with a non-compliant flagpole, to cover their legal bills. The last I saw of them, they were loading a U-Haul in the dead of night, their faces pale and drawn. There was no compliance cruiser to see them off, just the quiet, satisfied stares of their former neighbors. We rewrote the bylaws. We put in checks and balances, term limits, and transparent financial reporting requirements. We created a neighborly assistance clause to help residents like Mrs. Gable who fall on hard times. The binder is still there, but it's no longer a weapon. It's what it was always supposed to be, a simple agreement to keep the grass cut and the neighborhood a decent place to live. Sometimes I still think about that final, glorious spreadsheet I made, the one that laid out their entire scheme in neat, undeniable columns. It was, I have to admit, the most satisfying ledger I have ever balanced. My lawn is still perfectly manicured, but the peace I feel now isn't just about the straight lines. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a bully can be beaten, a kingdom can fall, and sometimes the guy who just wants to follow the rules is the most dangerous person to cross. And I have to wonder, in how many other seemingly peaceful suburban cul-de-sacs is a story just like this one waiting to be written? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.